All right, episode 17. You know what's interesting about 17?
What's interesting about 17?
Flip it around and you get 71. And if you add 71 to 17, you get 88. There's nothing
Those
interesting
are.
about 17.
I didn't think so, but I gotta hope.
Well, I'm glad I could crush your hopes already.
That is what you did. You made me sad.
Yay. So this week we only have two questions, but the questions themselves, I guess, are more open ended. So
Okay.
who's going first?
You wanna go first?
All right. So my question is basically how do you feel about the shifting away, and I don't know if I should use the phrase shifting away considering we're pretty much shifted completely away, but
Mm-hmm.
the sort of disappearance of the overworld map in a lot of Chirpagas.
Okay. Um, I feel like there's a place for improvement, which is what some of that shifting away is trying to do. They're trying to improve on narrative pacing and making it more direct to avoid, getting lost or confused and all that. And I feel like that's in some people's minds a sense of progression that I think there is room for and should be a thing. But I also feel like there is a space for that overworld, but I wonder if that space is being taken over by like just a different genre. Because the way I see it is the overworld is for old school style what RPGs were originally based off, like the D&D style where you're just a character in a world doing a thing. And I feel like that's what most of the open world Western RPGs are that all still have an overworld. And I feel like the JRPG was originally a more narrative focused, streamlined game. So I am kind of okay with JRPGs specifically losing it because we're seeing that open world free to go wherever you want more in Western RPGs.
Well, my counter to that would be that open worlds they're honestly just as linear as the new system, which tends to be interconnected areas.
Hmm.
In fact, Octopath Traveler doesn't have a world map, and it's just as open as an open world game.
Okay.
But then you have something like Final Fantasy VII, where for the most part, it's very, it's still a
It's
linear experience. It's just the open world offers
is
that
a
openness in
yeah.
terms of. But there's two things that really, I don't want to say bug me. One kind of bugs me, but the other one is just kind of worth mentioning.
Okay.
So the first thing that's worth mentioning is scale and how it affects scale.
Okay.
So Jerpigas used to be about saving the world, and you actually explored a world, the whole
Yes.
world. It was a world map.
Okay.
That doesn't happen anymore
Yeah, that's true.
because what's happened is with this shift away from a world map towards something that is more one to one in terms of scale,
Okay.
it shifts the way you have to look at the world and
Hmm.
make the world. So most of them tend to focus on continents.
Yeah.
Like this is the whatever continent that you're exploring around.
Yeah.
And I think while that's fine in some cases, in others it tends to sort of detract or lose something in terms of the scale and the feeling of going on this grand journey.
It can, but I there are counterexamples where I think that you still get rid of that overworld, but there's so many of these interconnected zones, and you see them spread out throughout the world in a way that you still get some of that scale.
Well, give me an
And
example.
it's like the one that I'm thinking of, Grace's. Grace's, you still explore the whole world. You could still, see all the different continents, not just your one, and you still get that sense of this world is big without needing just a big open world map.
And see, I never get that. In fact, to me, Grace's world is extraordinarily tiny.
Yeah.
It's definitely the smallest of all the Tales games. But part of that with Grace's has to do with the way it was so strictly themed.
Hmm.
You had basically grassland, desert land, Iceland, and then Mars.
Yeah, I wasn't that
And it
that I wasn't a fan of. I can admit I wasn't a fan of that either.
it took what was already a fairly small feeling world and made it feel even more restrictive by having such harsh contrasts between
See, and
everything.
I
See, to me, Graces is one of the worst examples of this
see because
because to me it doesn't even hit the point of making the zone or the area feel more intimate, which is what I think you can get with
okay.
this style of system. To me,
Hmm.
it's just this really weird. I mean, from what I understand, it was basically done because of the limitations of the hardware with the Wii,
Okay.
and it just makes this weirdo situation where like you just run across like two screens of field, and then bam, you're in the new area.
I mean,
It doesn't work
I,
for me.
as
The
far as
because
actual size, I think you're right. I do think it had the smallest amount of just like physical landmass. But the way because maybe because there were so many zones, or maybe it was because the three continents were so strictly different. To me, I still got this perception of a bigger world with more areas, even if it was smaller literally.
and that's where I'm gonna come back, and this was what I was gonna say. Like you walked right into it.
Yeah,
It's about an illusion, really, ultimately. The
yeah,
world map is because, like I said, even with your Final Fantasy, old school world maps that everybody loves to tout as whatever the big
yeah.
old world map, you still ultimately can only have one place that you're supposed to go. There
Hmm.
can be like maybe one or two places you can visit early or out of sequence, but it doesn't actually progress the game's story.
Yeah,
So in a way, what it's really doing isn't so much giving you the openness from a gameplay perspective. It's about creating an illusion of a larger world.
yeah.
And that's where what I'm saying for me is Grace's even failed at that.
Okay, it's like opinions, but I think Grace's, did a good job of that. And I
I
get,
think every game after Grace's did a better job of it, and I still think
yeah,
they're really, really bad, frankly. Like, really just god awful, man.
yeah. I mean, my thought is, like you said, it's all just an illusion to make it look better. Why don't we get rid of that and just actually make those zones better? Make the areas that we're at better and give you that sense of scale instead of just building this big fake empty open blob in between your points.
And
And like when you're going from say town to dungeon, you go into the world map and it's big and open and massive, but you're just going a beeline straight there. Or you can have a specific highway with specific things and little routes to explore and come back onto the main road. You can have these things to make that road more engaging instead of requiring this big bland straight line on the open overworld.
you can, and I
You,
agree that that would absolutely be the best. I think it would be a compromise because again, you still lose the scale because there's no way you can make an interesting world that's that big.
yeah.
But where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought because I was thinking of Final Fantasy 12. Um,
What you
the
got?
problem tends to be that they just don't.
They
And
don't.
the Tales series is to me just the perfect example of they have just not figured out how to make compelling environments.
No, Tails doesn't because each zone in Tails, honestly, aside from Grace's, which has highways, each other zone in Tails is just a big rectangle connected to another rectangle, and then you're in the city.
See, I wouldn't even
And
say rectangles. I just say blobs.
I mean,
It,
yeah,
it looks
blobs is
like coffee stains, like somebody just put a cup of coffee out on the fucking piece of paper and then pulled it away, and then there's your map.
it does, and that's bad.
And they're not
But
compelling and they're not good.
they're not. But because I feel like they're trying to imitate that open world of here's a big open blob, go explore it, and when you're ready, the exit's over there.
And they
I,
definitely tried to
it's
do
like
that with Zestiria. That was they even used the word open world a lot, even though it's not.
it's not. And that's the impression that I get is that they're trying to do an open world but smaller, and it just gets the shittiest aspects of both.
And that's kind of the question with these new areas. And it's one thing that I kind of come back to is size part of the problem? Are they too small or are they too big?
In
But I think ultimately the answer I came to
mhm,
was that they're just not dynamic enough. There's not enough going on in how you navigate them
there's not.
to make them interesting. And
It's like
to
well,
talk about games that sort of I think sort of do it well.
okay,
One would be Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I don't know about Chronicles 1 or X. I never fucking played them.
hmm
But some of the earlier areas, not so much the later areas. The later areas, they clearly ran out of budget.
yeah.
But the
There were paths and verticality and
yeah, all
the
sorts of different ways to approach and interact with the world
mhm,
that I think really did a lot to set it apart.
yeah.
And perspective is another huge thing that comes into this, where when you have a 3D camera, you really have to, it really changes the way you have to design things.
Mhm.
But I, I feel like I got off my point in terms of scale. But it just, to close out that thought, it turns it from a globe trotting adventure,
Yeah.
which I think something like Vesperia really captured very well,
Okay.
which also noteworthy, it just did have a very large world map.
hmm
Admittedly, it wasn't the most packed to the brim world map, but that's my point is not that,
Yeah.
because I agree with you. Ideally, they would have an interesting route to the next dungeon.
hmm
I agree with you wholeheartedly there.
Okay.
It's just you always lose that sense of this is a globe-trotting adventure versus hiking around the continent.
You do lose that, but maybe losing that globe-trotting adventure is better for the sense of a more well-paced and defined narrative story.
Well, I don't think the pacing is
Maybe.
affected by it at all.
It is if you try to get the most out of the world. If you explore the world like the point of an overworld feels like, and if you go out on random jets here and there and come back and go around and explore the world like is the point of the world, you do. That's the problem that
Yeah, but you do shit like that in other games too that don't even have. I mean, you do that in every fucking Tales game,
yeah,
regardless of whether it has an open world or not. You do that in Cold Steel too because you have a fucking airship.
yeah.
Whether or not there's an open world doesn't really impact the pacing of the story.
I mean, I feel like it does though. Well, it does if you take time to explore it. I'm thinking like back to Grace's. Grace's, there's no open world, so you're going strictly from event to story event, and the narrative is paced around going straight from one thing to the other.
But even in Graces, there's tons of stuff, or there's stuff on the side, and once you get the airship, a ton of side quests open up,
Yeah, and once you
and
get
a
the
lot of
airship,
the highways suck shit on Mars.
yeah, they do.
God, they're
Mars sucks.
fucking awful.
Yeah, they are.
Like
But
you want to talk about a pace killer, having to run across three screens of the same fucking screen of red rock, having the time of my
yeah,
life.
because they tried to be open and bigger and give you more world to explore instead of funneling you straight to the next event.
Now the problem is, again, and we come back to this, they did it badly.
They did do it badly.
It's just red rock with nothing there.
They did do it badly. I mean,
I'm not
maybe it.
saying that like it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
It does give you a more intimate experience when it's with just a country, but you
Hmm.
also don't get that sense that like, oh, I've seen other cultures in the world. It's just
True.
this one little area. Like you just there's a sense of scale that is ultimately lost.
The
And
sense of yeah.
I don't think one is better than the other, but I think it's sad that one is now so rare.
See, I'm gonna go back to that first thing I said. I don't think the overworld is gone from gaming. I think it's just shifted to a new genre. I think that's where the Western RPG
But
open world
Western
game.
RPGs are completely different because Western RPGs don't even give a shit about the narrative half the time.
They are completely different, but I think that's where the open world went. I think that's where the overworld went. It went to this genre that plays on the strength of the overworld. The strength of what the overworld should be, like you said, is scale. And that is one thing that these open world games, at least decent ones, have, is they have a sense of scale and they have a sense of things to do in the overworld.
Do they?
Which
I would argue
good
that they don't.
good ones. You know, good ones.
Even then, I feel like they don't.
Yeah,
I mean, to take it to contrast, take something like Trails,
okay,
where they have multiple games set in one area
okay,
of this larger world map.
okay.
That how is that any different from what Bethesda does with the Elder Scrolls games, where each one is just one area, one nation of a larger map? Like you don't really have this big open world with so many diverse cultures and whatever that you can go around and explore like you would have in something like Tales of Vesperia or the old Final Fantasies. You just have Skyrim or Tamriel or whatever the fuck it was called, Cyrodiil, that's what it was.
Yeah, but tell me that Skyrim doesn't feel bigger when you're walking across it, and that there's not more stuff to do as far as random caves and side quests and reasons to explore and things to find in the open world of Skyrim versus the open world of Final Fantasy.
Well, I don't really think there's a whole shitload to find in the open world of Skyrim. It's one of my perpetual problems with open world games. They can't give you anything to find to justify their fucking open world. But
Yeah,
but
but
but what I'm saying is that for the purpose of the narrative, which is the strength of the Jerpaga, scale and other nations can play and other cultures can play a large role in the narrative.
can.
Again, having a large globe-trotting adventure means more when you can actually explore more than just two nations at war.
Okay.
And there are just certain things like going to the frozen wild north that nobody else has ever gone to that you can't really get so much in a smaller game because again it's all defined by that continent.
Well, why does it have to be defined? Why can't we have not an open world, but go to other continents?
Budget.
That's not a well. That's it's like that's not a sense of the world itself. That's not we're not limiting ourselves because we don't have an open world. We're limiting ourselves for all these other reasons.
Well, but it's a very real and practical reason. ostensibly,
Eh,
there's no reason you couldn't have, in terms of technically, there's no reason you couldn't have a game that, like, let's say, let's use Trails again, covers
okay,
the entirety of that map. It's just that it
okay,
would take shit zillion years to make, cost a shit zillion dollars, probably wouldn't even fit on one disc. Like, there's just all these practical hurdles that keep it from
okay.
being a possibility. It's like random encounters back in the NES days. The overworld was more of a way to work around a limitation than something unto itself. It's just that unlike random encounters, which I don't think add anything to the experience, the
Hmm.
overworld actually accomplished something that I think is being lost with the newer games. And another, to kind of build on this, gets me into the second point that I brought up ages ago. I'm glad this is actually a long topic. Um, One thing that you definitely lose that I've never seen recreated in any of these games that
Hmm.
don't have an overworld that I miss, honestly,
Yeah.
is the sense of progression, which was usually defined by first you get something that lets you maneuver over land more efficiently, then you get
Okay.
something that lets you maneuver in the seas, you get a boat, and then you get
Okay.
something that flies.
Yeah.
So, to follow the Final Fantasy Chocobo boat airship.
Yeah.
And it was really fun when you finally got, like, okay, I got the boat. Now more places are open. I can go explore more places. I fucking hate the boat. But once you got the airship, it was like really cool because it's like now the whole world is your fucking oyster.
Yeah.
It's like this is great, and I have never seen this recreated in the new style. And it's just
No,
something else that has been lost.
that one is. I have no argument against that one. That one, yeah.
And I miss it. And that's where I'm saying, like, I don't think one is better than the other. I'm just sad that one is being completely phased out almost.
I think
I think
I
if you
think
played
what
Octopath Traveler, because Octopath Traveler actually does a really good job of having zones, but
okay.
still feeling pretty large
Okay.
and giving you that sense of exploring a map
Okay.
without having an overworld. It doesn't have the scale and it doesn't have
Okay.
the progression, but I think it has everything else that hallmarks a good overworld.
Okay. I don't know. I wonder if a really good overworld might be better than a really good not overworld, but the reality of making a really good overworld isn't gonna happen.
Well, that comes back to the practicality of it.
Mm,
In terms of if you get rid of the practical limitations, there's no reason one couldn't completely. You couldn't
yeah.
have both. You just
Mm,
have this fucking mega game.
yeah. It's like, because I mean, I'm not opposed to the overworld. I mean, one of our first episodes, I even said the RPG I would like to see in the future bring back the overworld, but just do it right, make it not feel empty. And maybe I'm just when I'm thinking about overworld, I go straight to Final Fantasy VII because that's what I played most recently with an overworld, and it just felt like a big empty blob to go from here to here,
Yeah,
and there was no there was no personality to the world, I guess.
and it's a pity because even when you get a world like Tales of Vesperia's, which has lots of neat little areas, there's just nothing there.
Hmm.
And this is where I come back to in terms of going forward in a positive direction.
Yeah.
I would like to have played Xenoblade Chronicles because hopefully that does a better job than having a bunch of disconnected zones. But
Yeah.
something like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, where if they weren't, separate islands, basically,
Hmm.
if you just had those big zones out in the middle, but they're really big, really complicated, particularly the first two,
Yeah.
the Grimoire, whatever, I don't want to say forest land, but you know what I mean, the
The
plains
foresty one.
area, and
It's
then
like
the
the
purple,
foresty.
the purple foresty one.
Okay.
Those two areas were big and intricate and had lots of stuff to find and lots of little nooks and crannies.
They were. And they did.
And you can just tell the budget went downhill as Moradrin, the desert area, was less interesting because it was mostly desert. But it still
Hmm.
had some stuff. And then you get to like fucking Iceland and there's just nothing.
There's nothing to do. And
We have no budget. And if you were able to keep
if
those
you were,
first two, that level of quality through the whole thing,
if you can make an overworld that good for the whole world, then I'm totally down with that because that makes the world feel like worth being in.
yeah. And on top of that, if you make it so they're not all islands, but just make it one, large landmass, I think then you get the best of both worlds.
Okay.
You can still make something that feels
Mhm.
large in scale and feels adventurous. And I think even if you wanted to, you could go into navigation tools like bringing back like horses or something, like tools to help you navigate the world better.
Mhm.
Because, one of the more frustrating things about Xenoblade Chronicles is just,
You got to run. That's
yeah.
it.
So, I mean, if you made an area like that, I mean, the first area of Xenoblade Chronicles is so big, fuck yeah, dude, give me a fucking bird that just flies over everything and then opens up new vertical areas.
So yeah, 'cause, I mean, there were areas that were a pain in the ass to reach because there were like ladders and you had to go around and then take this ramp and yeah, the progression of getting a bird to be able to fly up there and not have to go this crazy back route up the mountain and shit, that would be a nice feeling of progression that yeah, you don't get anymore.
So,
And
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, I'm good.
I was just gonna say, and that to me, in terms of being very rare and ending on a positive note, that to me is a positive example, and what I hope to see is striven for more.
I like not because I know I've sounded very anti-open world and I'm not. I'm anti-bad open world. And I feel like the ones of the past that we're not seeing anymore are not good ones, that those are bad ones. And I don't want to see those bad, empty open worlds come back. I want to see them replaced with good open worlds, or if not, give me good hallway paths over a bad open world.
And that's fair. I'm none of my
So that,
points were addressing the fact that they're empty. They are empty. I grant you that, and I
so they
agree
are,
it's disappointing and frustrating.
and it's like, and I don't want to return to that because that sucked. Playing the old Final Fantasies and you just gotta they're empty and they're boring and that sucked. But if we could make a good one, I would love to play a game with a good, engaging open world.
The old open worlds suck, but I don't exactly think that Tales of Berseria's way of doing it was a whole hell of a lot better.
I don't remember what Berseria did.
And that pretty much just sums it up. It's the same fucking shitty ass blobs and environments.
Yeah.
And I mean, okay, one of the problems with Berseria, and this I guess will tie this in because it goes in hand with part of what makes it so complicated,
Okay.
is you really have to individualize each area. I didn't realize this until I played it multiple times and was really looking at it, but like if there's a forest in Tales of Berseria, and I think it's the same in Zestiria and Exilia,
Hmm.
you would think that the thing that defines your path,
Yeah.
the barrier that you go up against that you can't progress past here, would
Hmm.
be trees.
That would make sense.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's a cliff, and all the trees are behind the cliff. In fact, if
That's
you look at Berseria, almost everywhere you can't go, it's either there's an ocean there, or there's a mountain there, or there's a cliff there.
that's kind of lame.
Yeah, and that's where it's like you can't do that, dude. You got to give the areas a feeling of their own. Like
Yeah.
a
Yeah. The
mountain is fine, the ocean is fine, but a cliff, a fucking cliff,
no, maybe I mean even a cliff. If you're on a mountain and the
yeah.
cliff, then that's fine. Then a cliff makes sense.
But why
But if
am
you're
I
in the
in a
middle,
fucking forest and there's cliffs everywhere? Why am I
yeah,
in
that's
a basin? Like, and that basically sums up the Tales philosophy. Everywhere is a basin.
yeah.
The whole world is just one giant. basin that leads into other
to another one.
basins. It's terrible,
Yeah, it is terrible.
and that's I honestly personally would rather the days of fucking Vesperia where okay at least I had this big pretty empty admittedly but fucking pretty.
Yeah,
At least it looked good. It wasn't a fucking basin with cliffs everywhere. And look, sometimes the cliffs have trees on them because that way it's a forest. Ugh.
yeah, yeah. Bad zones are just as bad as bad overworlds.
And let me just say that like it, again to go back to trails because we're the trails podcast.
Of course we are.
I get it. They didn't have the budget to do a whole lot more than they did. It's fine. I don't have a
Mm.
problem with Trails. In fact, I think Trails did a pretty good job with what budget they had.
Yeah, because I mean, they're past, they're highways. They have little routes to go off the side, and then there's something over there, and then you come back, and there's
I,
personality to their paths more than you know
I
than
think
there could be.
there's a lot of room for improvement. I haven't played Cold Steel 3, but I also know that they were made for fucking Vita.
So there is a lot of there's a lot of improvement over other things.
But you know, I get budget limitations. I'm not like
Hmm.
an asshole about that. It's just you've got these series that definitely could do better and
Yeah,
just aren't. And I think part of it is just that there's no pressure on them to do better. And something is being lost because they aren't.
yeah.
And that's, I think we'll leave
Sad.
this off. Unless you have anything else to add.
Way to leave it on a downer.
Hey, we talked about Array of Hope. We
A
talked about
ray
what's
of
being,
hope.
but
Yeah,
there's like the Xenoblade games that are doing it right.
Xenoblade
And
did do it right.
I'm really hoping, I doubt it will, but I'm hoping Tales of Arise is taking notes because Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was pretty successful.
Yeah,
And it's like, oh, this is how to make zones. I mean, that's the thing, dude. I hate Xenoblade Chronicle 2. I fucking hate that game. But the one thing that just I cannot deny is that its environment design is
it's good.
gorgeous.
Yes, it is.
It
E- Even if everything else kind of sucks balls, the worlds are nice.
yeah, and I hate
Yeah,
it. I cannot underscore how much I hate that game. But
I liked it.
fuck the worlds. They're gorgeous,
Yeah,
especially the first two.
especially the first two.
Iceland was a bit dull, but like I said, I appreciate that they ran out of money and half their crew was busy working on Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
So I get it. So yeah, there's my argument. So let's go to your thing.
All right, my thing is a little different than the way we normally do our topics, but whatever. So, as you may or may not remember, a while back, I kind of just for the fun of it started designing my own game with a couple of my own little mechanics and things. And I'm curious on your opinion on one of my things and what you think I might be able to do to make it better or make it work a little more proper than it does. And one of the things I'm working on in the combat is the system for turn order, determining who gets to go. And what I'm hoping to do, it's based off of the Tails system of delay, where you take and then you're placed somewhere in the lineup term, depending on what your speed is, what action you took, yada yada yada. But I'm also trying to add like rows, like the old school front row, and in my case, a middle row, and the speed that you go through your delay changes depending on what row you're in. If you're in the front row, your 100 delay goes as fast as 90. But if you're in the back row, your 100 delay goes slower to 110. And my idea is that as you attack the enemy, you'll move forward, and as you get attacked, you move back. That way you can like incentivize attacking the front row and put your tanks in the front row to try and you know aim your combat a little bit more that way.
I think I don't know how I feel about getting attacked and attacking moving where you are in your rows, but I think the idea of it sounds to me like you want it to be kind of a risk reward thing.
I do. I mean, my when you were as I'm saying, like, attack and move forward, I'm wondering if maybe casting magic or heals you won't move. And I'm looking into maybe like giving my tank an ability where he can take a hit and not be forced back because he's the tank, and make moving between the rows more of like a mechanic unto itself. So that way, like the healers or the casters don't feel like they have to do nothing because if they get moved forward, they're gonna die. You know what I mean?
Well, isn't the trade-off to that like delay and agility is always good even for mages. It's why in
Mhm.
Cold Steel, even though my mage character may be my mage character, if she doesn't
Yeah.
have a certain amount of speed, she'll never get a fucking turn.
Yeah, and
And that's where I feel like the balance works itself as long as you make it so that being in the back row, you're really safe, but you have really limited offensive ability
okay.
because it takes you so long to do anything. Whereas in the front row, you you're a lot faster, you're a lot quicker,
Mm.
and you could also do a thing where, dependent on how many rows separate you and the enemy,
Yeah.
affects the amount of damage you hit the enemy for.
I thought about doing that, and
So that someone in the back line trying to attack someone else in the back line almost wouldn't work.
I thought about that, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. I don't know why, but I didn't like the idea of having a defense row or like a fighter's row and a caster's row because that's what that always inevitably becomes is you have
Well,
your fighters in the front and you have your casters in your back and then that's the end of it.
again,
And I was
it
trying to
comes down
avoid
to
that.
how much you want to weight the delay.
Mhm.
If you weight the delay in such a way that it becomes unadvantageous for your casters even to be in the back, because you could tie in spell speed to this as well.
Mhm.
It, if you also wanted to get weird with it, there might be a way to travel in, like spells have to travel a certain distance, but there's a lot of things you can do, and the problem with balancing something like this is that you're just going to need to do it and work with the variables.
Yeah, and that's a pain in the ass.
It is a massive pain in the ass, but welcome to game design. It's a massive pain in the ass
Yeah,
because
pretty much.
this is something that I think a lot of people get shit on that I sympathize on,
Yeah.
and that's when you're balancing a game internally,
Mhm.
it's a lot
You
easier to have holes in your vision because you don't have 10,000 people trying to break your fucking game.
yeah,
And
which was
that's sorry, God.
which I was gonna say was gonna be one of my things is since breaking games is one of the things you do, what would you do in a system like this that like what do you feel like would be the most optimal way to do use this? Or how would you
Well,
break it?
I mean, pretty much so far as I can tell, there's no disadvantage to having everyone in the front row as long as you can tank all the damage.
Yeah.
It comes back to that balancing thing where you're gonna need to approach it. Think of it like Persona's weakness system, I think,
Mhm.
where you have to be incentivized to be in certain rows at certain times.
See,
So
and
like
my
you're gonna have to have bosses that like have moves that will just outright kill you if you're in the front row.
yeah,
So that you have to move back rows, but you're going to have to find ways also that maybe you can tank the hit if you work a certain strategy.
okay.
It's going to be about finding that system where you don't want to negate the whole point of your system by having every because just the way you described it to me just now, it's like, why would I not just throw everybody in the front row? You know, you say mages in the back row, but fuck that. We're talking about turn order here.
Because my thought is the mages, because if you're in the front row, you're more likely to get attacked because you're faster, you're more of a threat, and your mages being that high of a threat will die just because they're attacked more often.
But again, I come
Whereas,
back to, and this is a problem I've had with a lot of games, is like, so I get attacked, so what? You know,
yeah,
big deal. Most games aren't hard enough because it's one thing I've noticed playing both Cold Steel and Persona on hard. And the
okay,
more things I play on hard, the more I notice this.
hmm,
Basically, what it comes down to most of the time is if the enemy gets a turn, you're fucked.
yeah,
So, for the most part, the game, in both the case of Persona and Cold Steel, becomes a matter of how can I make sure I get the most turns and the enemy gets none?
okay,
Because most of the time, the second the enemy gets the turn, shit starts going south really bad. And
yeah,
it has to because most of the time you have the power to kill the enemy in one turn.
okay,
And you don't want to sacrifice that because you don't want the battles to end up, every battle to be super long and prolonged.
yeah,
But at the same time, you want some strategic thought to it. So you're going to have to, if you want to make a system like that, I feel like you're going to have to make a system where your enemies hit fucking hard to the point where they can kill a character in one turn depending on how things play out.
and I was thinking about that too. If I can make the difference in health and armor between the tanks and the heal and the casters so much that the tanks can take that much more damage than the healers who die in one or two hits
I think you can, but then you come back to how limiting are you?
on my placement where it has there's
Yeah,
no.
again, it comes back to you don't want the mages in the back all the time, but you
Mhm.
have to find some reason to put them back there that isn't so restrictive that there's not advantages to having them in the front, and that's where you're going to have to either work something with how magic works,
Mhm.
work something with attacking across the line.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of the problem is there's a lot of different directions you could take it
Yeah, and I'm
that it's I can't really give you any answers because there's just so many different things you could do.
I'm
Like
trying to figure out
you need
exactly
to hone in
what.
on something that you want to do and then
Mhm.
workshop that.
Yeah, that's
But
like I said, only recently restarted, but I want the rows to be more of a just the combat in general, honestly, to be more of a speed based as far than than raw numbers. So that's why I wasn't really liking the idea of more defense the farther back you get.
well, I was just using that as
Yeah,
well. Again, then it just comes back to why would you not always be in the front row then?
it's a higher risk for characters with less health.
But then the problem then
It's a,
is you're relying on RNG,
yeah,
and that's where I start getting pissed off.
okay,
Like, oh, the character was in the back row and you hit it anyway, and now they're dead. Thanks, asshole.
okay.
But that's a personal thing.
It's a and that I wanted that risk to still be there, but not as high.
But
Could I? It's like I'm wondering if that attack does say 95% health regardless of whether you're in the front and the back, but you get attacked way more often in the front, or is that still not enough of an incentive to move around?
It
if you can.
it can be. It's just gonna come down to situations where, again, it just depends on how you balance it. It depends on how many enemies there are. Depends on how things attack.
Hmm.
I'm gonna say it depends on how long the fights already take. There's a lot of shit to balance, and to make this sort of, because I'm sorry, I just can't answer that right now. It's too early.
Yeah, no, I know.
But so to make this a more general thing, I really do think one of the things that gets glossed over in the making of games, and especially RPGs,
Hmm.
is the variable adjustments.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, think about it. Every single enemy has to have a health amount defined for it,
Yeah.
and every single bit of equipment has to have a variable assigned to it.
Hmm.
And you have to find a way to balance it so that it's not too strong or too weak for every single piece of equipment in the game at every single point in the game.
Hmm.
And that's just a lot of tedious work, man.
It is.
Like
I
like
believe me.
some
I've noticed.
somebody has to go in and input the variables for how much random bore 12 has that you as a
Believe me.
player kill in half a second and never think of again.
I've done some of that math. It's awful.
Yeah. And how much longsword plus one gives you.
Yeah.
It's some bullshit.
It's. Believe me, I know. I.
Making games is not the most exciting of professions most of the time, but the same can be said of pretty much
Anything.
every creative endeavor.
Hmm.
They all have their ups and their downs.
Yeah, they do. I just wanted to do something with a familiar feeling, but with a unique twist to it. Rows are common, but rows based on damage are common, but rows based on speed or some other stat are significantly less common. And I was going for, recognizable but still unique in its own right.
I mean, I come back again to Radiant Historia.
Yeah.
That was a game on a 3x3 grid, but you could knock enemies around, and the whole point was to knock them into positions and stack them on top of each other.
Hmm.
And enemies weren't necessarily one square large.
Hmm.
So in
Yeah,
terms
Fairy
of
Tail tried that.
you're talking about moving things around, that's where my mind instantly goes to.
Okay,
If you're thinking about like inspiration or something you might want to,
try that.
yeah.
So, all right. It's like, cause yeah, Fairy Tail did something similar of on a grid and you can move enemies around and your attacks are on a shape, but it wasn't as good as I'm imagining Radiant Historia is.
I liked Radiant Historia's way of doing it.
Yeah. All right.
It was
Maybe
a
I'll look
good
at that.
game.
But that's where I'm kind of looking right now as far as one of my combat mechanics goes. I was curious what your just rough impression
It's just way too early
was.
to tell. I mean, you know the problem. It sounded good on paper.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to have a really fixed idea so that you can pick in the nuances
Mm,
because like as soon as you throw it out there, my mind starts thinking of ways I would do it, and when I can come up with like three different ways almost instantly of addressing the problem, but that are radically different,
yeah.
it tells me you need a more finite idea before I can really comment.
Yeah. Because I've looked into some of those other ideas that you said and played around with some things, and I don't know. I like some of the ideas, but some of them I'm making an effort to avoid, maybe almost at the cost of I don't know, good mechanical development. Like, like I said, I'm really making an effort to avoid different rows taking different amounts of damage. That's like one of my goals is to avoid that. But it makes so much sense that finding something else to do is difficult. But I don't know.
And maybe you just need to reconsider the concept of roles in this system
Yeah, I
rather than
might.
having something being, mage or fighter to make speed pretty much be the central thing because ultimately you're used to
It
thinking about strength and defense, but if speed is the central theme of your game, maybe there's a way through the problem by
to
reapproaching it through that
re
concept.
rewrite my characters as this is a slow character and this is a fast character instead of this is a tank and this is a caster.
Yeah, but you're gonna have to find something more interesting than that.
Well, yeah, but that would be a starting point instead of because no, that actually makes sense. If my combat and this Rose idea is based around speed, maybe start my characters based around speed and build them around that instead of around a strength and a magic stat.
Well, yeah, and I would think about the way they attack as well. Like, let's
Okay.
say a character is slower,
Hmm.
to use the common trope, slower but hits harder
Yeah,
versus
and
something
is it
that's quicker but maybe hits twice.
weaker? Hmm.
And then you could, if you really wanted to like add another layer to it that isn't necessarily, you could add like an armor stat to enemies where certain attacks deal more damage or you have to like penetrate armor with certain
Okay.
characters. Like let's say you have a rogue character who's really efficient against unarmored units with his
So
daggers.
I could have like my slow character like just break the armor and then have my fast character kind of come in and take over after that.
Yeah, but then
Hmm.
you're just going to need something in there to balance. Why would you not put everybody in the front lines?
And I was hoping to do that with just risk of being attacked, but yeah, maybe something else, some other reason to not be there other than just that percentage chance.
Yeah, but that would be my suggestion: is rather than thinking about it from a traditional role point of view, think about it from what you're trying to do, and then discard your traditional concepts of roles. Because I brought this up in MMOs before. One of my problems with MMOs is
Hmm.
that they're too fixated on the tank healer DPS triad.
Yeah, okay.
And I think if they could find a way to break out of that,
It would be more engaging or
yeah,
more, yeah.
yeah, or you could offer up more diversity. I mean, if you, like I said, if you had a tank who could heal themselves
Hmm.
but couldn't heal everyone else, then you can bring on an extra DPS, and now maybe you have the DPS if your DPS aren't freaking retards.
Then they can get through everything without the need for a dedicated healer because the tank can kind of, because a good tank can take care of both of those roles on its own.
Yeah, and it becomes a higher risk, higher reward. Okay, you're not running the traditional setup, but you also deal more damage. So if it works, you can do it more quickly.
Okay.
But that would be just so breaking the mold that people's brains would just explode. And
Yeah, it
that's what
would.
I'm saying. It's like for yours, maybe just stop trying to think of things in those traditional roles and
Okay.
rethink of them in a way that specifically affects your system.
But okay.
Because that's what, again, Radiant Historia had to do.
And apparently it worked out really well.
Yeah. So, and it It really came down to how characters could push and pull enemies
Okay.
on the grid.
All right.
So yeah, that'd be my advice.
That actually makes a fair amount of sense. I
All
might give
right.
that a try. All right.
And this ends episode 17. We'll see you next time for episode 18, where maybe we hopefully have like more
More
questions.
questions
Whatever. It's all
later.
good.